Good evening, class. This is Professor Katia Prince. Today we'll be learning about assessment. Specifically, we'll learn about formative and summative assessments. As far as the objectives are concerned, we'll first define and discuss the value of formative and summative assessments. We'll also discuss feedback as it pertains to these form of assessments. And lastly, we'll talk about the specific differences between the assessments. Now, as we all know, assessment is a crucial part of instruction. It's important for the instructor and the learners to have information about the learner's abilities, their progress in the classroom, and their overall development. So in this case, both formative and summative assessments are used to actually measure a learner's knowledge. As it pertains to formative assessment, now this is a type of assessment that's carried out specifically during the instructional process to determine what adjustments need to be made to improve teaching or learning. It is not part of the grading process, but as I previously mentioned, a part of the instruction process. It has to directly relate to the learning objectives and instructional activities. But more importantly, formative assessments have to provide feedback. In short, the goal of formative assessments is to monitor student learning. And as you can see with the diagram here, it's a cycle whereas instruction is given, the formative assessment tool is put in place, and based on the assessment tool, adjustments, if needed, are made to instruction, again, to continue to ensure that students are progressing through the classroom and are completing the learning objectives that were set forth by the instructor. Some strategies that can be used in terms of formative assessments are summaries and reflections, which typically allow students to stop and reflect, to make sense of what they've heard or read, and to try to derive some personal meaning from their learning experiences. Another strategy are lists, charts, and graphic organizers. They help students to organize information, make connections, and kind of note and see the relationships through the use of various organizers. And lastly, you have collaborative activities. With collaborative activities, students actually have the opportunity to communicate with others as they develop and demonstrate their understanding of certain concepts. Now, these strategies, they actually allow the instructor to check for understanding and, of course, gather evidence of learning in the classroom. So as you can see, they're specifically purposeful in terms of monitoring student learning, which is essentially, again, the goal of formative assessments. Now that we understand formative strategies, let us discuss summative strategies. Now, summative strategies actually measure the effectiveness of instructional programs at the end of an instructional unit or at a predetermined time. Summative evaluations are used to see if students have actually mastered specific competencies and to identify any instructional areas that need additional attention. So here, the goal is pretty much to evaluate student learning, and this evaluation, as I mentioned, takes place typically towards the end of an instructional unit or at a predetermined time by the instructor. In terms of tools, summative assessments are typically used as unit tests, midterm, final exams, projects, etc. Now, what's most important when it comes to using these assessments is feedback. Now, in terms of feedback, just to kind of define the word, it's information about how successful something has been or is being done. It has been said that good feedback practice is anything that might strengthen the student's capacity to self-regulate their own performance. A key thing to remember when it comes to feedback, it is very central as it pertains to formative assessments. Without feedback, formative assessments just doesn't work. The feedback is necessary so that students can make the necessary adjustments. As we mentioned, it's a good tool for self-regulation, and it truly helps students to develop independence in learning. So the feedback has to be specific. It must guide the learner in some way as to what they're doing wrong, what specifically needs to be addressed. Specifics need to be given as to how to improve the learning and what they can do themselves as self-directed learners to actually grasp whatever concept they may not have grasped. So when it comes to feedback, as I mentioned, it truly is essential to formative assessment to ensure that the appropriate adjustments are not just made by the students themselves, but sometimes to the instructor, depending on the formative assessment strategy that was utilized. So we've learned about formative and summative assessments. So just a quick little table to summarize these two assessments because they are very different. Whereas formative assessments are used, as I mentioned, throughout and during the unit of instruction, summative assessments are only used at the end of instruction. So that's a stark difference right there. And in terms of goals, formative assessments are used to redirect instruction and to help students improve learning. On the other hand, summative assessments are used to determine the level of accomplishment attained and is often the basis for assigning grade. So this is pretty much formative and summative assessments. As I mentioned at the beginning of this presentation, assessment is integral to the teaching and learning cycle. When planning assessment tasks as part of a unit of work, it's important to cater to all students in the class. And when it comes to assessment activities, there are a lot of different things to consider. Things like, what is the purpose of the assessment? Is it to inform planning? Is it to gather formative or summative information? What is the essential learning outcome that students will demonstrate? How can students demonstrate their learning? What evidence will the instructor use to collect this information? Those are some of the things to keep in mind when thinking about assessment and developing assessment tools, but more importantly, whether to use formative or summative assessment tools.